Counterintelligence Debrief. Restricted Distribution Assessment Platform Keth Vorel. Dralathi Strategic Assessment Directorate filed by Assessor Principal Veleth Soon, Counterintelligence Division Subject. Human Liaison Officer Marin Das. Cultural Exchange Attachment XT7. 6-week duration clearance. Senior Command Panel only distribution. 3 copies, no secondary transmission. I am filing this report because I am required to. That much I want stated plainly at the outset, before the panel reviews what follows, but that my position is clear. I am not filing this because I believe it will change how we conduct future exchanges overnight. I am not filing it because I expect the panel to find it fully credible on first reading. I was the assessor. I had all of the data in real time, and I did not find it credible until the 40-second window on day 42, when a Terran biological civilian looked directly at a sensor cluster I had not yet given her any reason to know existed, and told me, in 4 words, that she had known it was there. I am filing this report because I made an error of assessment that lasted 42 days, and it is the function of this division to document its errors with the same precision it applies to its successes, possibly more precision. The panel will decide what to do with what I am about to tell them. I am going to try to give them something worth deciding on. We'll begin with the standard context, because the standard context matters here more than it usually does. Assessment Platform Keth Vorel is not a diplomatic vessel. It does not function as a neutral meeting ground. The Accord's external designation for this platform is Coordinating Station Vethal 3, a joint logistics and communications relay at the intersection of the Keth Doral and Sora trade corridors, operated under shared flag for the benefit of 7 treaty signatories. That designation is accurate in the sense that a vessel can be accurately described by the flag it flies when the flag is not the whole story. The panel knows what Keth Vorel actually is. A Dralathi strategic intelligence facility, operating under full counterintelligence protocols since its commissioning, with a monitoring suite that has no peer in the joint use regions of this sector. Every room on this platform is instrumented. Every corridor, every shared workspace, the dining facility, the observation deck, the pressurized recreation spaces allocated to non-Dralathi visitors, the lounge on the 4th ring, the walkways connecting the coordination suites to the residential quarters, the residential quarters themselves, with the exception of the sealed personal hygiene spaces, which the Accord's shared use protocols require us to exempt from passive monitoring. Everything else. 41 sensor nodes, continuously active, cross-calibrated every 4 hours, recording to a central archive with redundant storage. The instruments are passive, unobtrusive, and designed to be invisible to a casual observer and to a sophisticated observer who does not know specifically what to look for. They have been here since the platform was commissioned. The humans served prior rotations at Keth Vorel did not know they were there. That was the premise of the exchange. I want the panel to understand that the premise was not unreasonable. It was, in fact, extremely well-founded, because it has worked without exception for 14 years and 9 species. Non-human species do not, as a rule, know when they are being monitored passively, and the monitoring is properly concealed. They behave as they would behave unmonitored. They speak candidly. They show stress at the moments they are actually stressed. Their physiological outputs correlate, as the doctrine has always held they will, with their actual internal states. This is not a judgment about other species. It is a physiological fact. A living body under stress produces outputs it cannot suppress. Heart rate elevates. Skin conductance rises. Muscular tension increases around the eyes and at the corners of the mouth and at the jaw. The vascular patterns in the face shift subtly toward threat response preparation. These outputs are involuntary. They are below the threshold of conscious control. They are, for this reason, the foundation on which we built the passive biometric keys monitoring approach. Not for Keth Vorel specifically, but for this entire division, over 400 years, across every species we have encountered that has a cardiovascular system and a nervous system and biology that responds to threat. The doctrine is not a guess. It is built on 4 centuries of consistent results. I am going to describe how the doctrine failed. I want to say one thing about the doctrine first. because I do not want the panel to read what follows as a dismissal of something that has served us 4 centuries and served us well. The doctrine is correct. It is correct for every species we have encountered with a cardiovascular system and a nervous system that responds to threat. It is correct in all probability for the vast majority of Terran individuals. What I am about to report is not evidence that the doctrine is wrong. It is evidence that the doctrine has an edge case, and that the edge case is capable of operating inside our monitoring programs for 42 days without producing a detectable deviation. That is not a reassuring distinction. I recognize that. I am making it anyway because precision matters in an assessment report, and the distinction between the doctrine is wrong and the doctrine has an exploitable ceiling in trained Terran individuals has different implications for how the panel responds. The exchange was standard in format. The Dralathi Human Coordination Accord had entered its 3rd operational year when Attachment XT7 was scheduled. Keth Vorel had hosted 2 prior human liaison officers for short rotations of 1 week each. Those exchanges had produced useful baseline data on Terran physiological profiles under platform conditions, and no significant anomalies worth reporting. Both prior officers had shown what we expected: moderate orienting response elevation upon arrival, a settling trend over the first 2 to 3 days, a stable low-stress baseline for the remainder of the rotation, small situational spikes during extended working sessions and any moments of mild environmental surprise. Clean data, useful data, the kind of data that gives an assessor confidence in her instruments. The 6-week cultural exchange attachment was a natural escalation of the prior short rotations, longer duration, broader scope of collaborative work, and a liaison officer with a broader brief than her predecessors. The Accord's Joint Coordination Office had proposed the longer format. We had agreed to it without hesitation because longer exposure produces richer data. The human assigned was Cultural Liaison Officer Maran Das, civilian staff. 15 years in Accord-related diplomatic and coordination work, spread across 3 prior joint postings. Fluent in 2 Dralathi language registers, she had spent, according to her personnel file, approximately 4 years in active language study prior to her first posting, and had maintained the fluency through subsequent Accord work. Annotation in the file was consistent, methodical, low profile, professionally cooperative. Her stress physiology history, drawn from the Accord's joint medical database, to which all liaison officers contribute voluntarily, showed a stable, low baseline individual. No significant prior health events. No documented anxiety markers. 1 entry noting mild environmental sensitivity to atmospheric pressure variance, which we accommodated with a standard pressure adjustment protocol, and which she had apparently requested as a matter of routine at every prior posting. Nothing filed retention. She was, on paper, a reliable mid-career diplomatic professional who would show up, do good work, and go home. She arrived on day 1 at the platform's secondary docking bay, which is the bay used for non-Dralathi visitors. She carried 3 pieces of personal luggage, 2 soft cases and 1 rigid container, and a flat rectangular carrying case, approximately half a meter by 1/3 of a meter, and perhaps 4 centimeters deep. When the arrival security officer asked about the flat case, she described its contents without hesitation. A handwritten correspondence journal of the type she said she had maintained since her first posting, 2 changes of formal diplomatic attire in compressed fold packaging, a portable atmospheric adjustment unit tuned to Terran standard pressure, humidity, and a collection of 8 small ceramic objects she described with a faint smile as having sentimental significance. The ceramic objects were small, irregular, and varied. The arrival scan showed them to be exactly what she said they were: fired clay, non-conductive, no internal components. One appeared to be a stylized animal. Another appeared to be a small vessel of some kind. The rest were abstract enough. Informed that our reference database did not return confident matches, our arrival officer noted, and I subsequently cleared. Because the relevant question was not what the objects depicted, but what they were made of, and they were made of clay. She was permitted to keep everything. The portable atmospheric unit was logged, cleared, and its calibration checked by our platform environmental staff. who confirmed it was producing Terran standard output and nothing else. The ceramics were scanned at multiple frequencies and cleared. None of it was a concern. None of it should have been a concern. It was the kind of orderly, unremarkable arrival that makes subsequent monitoring feel like a confirmation of what you already know, rather than an investigation of something you don't. She settled in. She learned the platform at a pace that I cataloged at the time as competent and unhurried, the pace of someone who has arrived at new postings, often enough to know that the first 3 days are for orientation and that there is no advantage in rushing them. She attended her first coordination meeting on day 2. She spent day 3 reviewing joint documentation protocols with the platform's Accord liaison staff. By day 4, she had identified the most efficient route between her residential quarters and the coordination suites, happened to take her past the platform's primary communication relay junction on the 3rd ring. I noted the route. I did not flag it as significant because there were 2 other efficient routes between those 2 points, and the one past the relay junction was platform layout, the most direct. People take the most direct route. It is not a signal. I am going to describe in detail what the monitoring suite was recording throughout this period, because I want the panel to see the data the way I saw it in real time, so they can understand why I did not escalate. The primary LICH monitoring suite aboard Keth Vorel operates on a continuous passive biometric array, 41 distinct sensor nodes distributed throughout the platform, cross-calibrated every 4 hours. The array measures 14 physiological channels simultaneously: cardiovascular output and rate, respiratory cadence and depth, surface temperature at 7 body site reference points, galvanic skin conductance, neurovascular dilation and contraction patterns in exposed skin regions of the face, hands and neck, pupillary response, where visually available from current node angles, microscopic retention across the full facial map, particular sensitivity at the periorbital region, the zygomatic region, and the mandibular region, postural shifting frequency and magnitude, blink rate, vocal harmonic patterns during speech including subharmonic baseline tracking during silence, secondary thermal imaging for confirming vascular data, and, where applicable, secondary signals from any portable electronic devices the subject carries. A channel that produced nothing of note, because her personal device use was limited and consistent with the kind of incidental daily use patterns we see in every liaison officer. The suite is calibrated to Terran biology. We updated those calibrations when the Accord was signed, using the joint medical database that humans contributed to the shared use protocols. We did not begin the exchange operating on legacy assumptions or approximate extrapolations from other primate species. We had good calibration data. 2 prior human rotations had validated those calibrations against real Terran individuals in a real operating environment, and the calibrations had held. I want the panel to understand that when I say the instruments were working correctly, I mean it in both the technical and the validated sense. We had tested them on Terran biology. They worked. Doss's data from the first week matched the theoretical model for a calm, settled, cooperative liaison officer so precisely that I remember thinking, when I reviewed the day 3 summary, she was an unusually clean data subject. Some individuals, of any species, produce noisier baselines than others. Cardiovascular rates that fluctuate more in response to minor stimuli. Galvanic readings that drift across the day in response to circadian rhythm. Dietary intake, minor thermal variation. The kind of low-level biological noise that is not a signal but that makes an assessor's job slightly more complicated because it requires more smoothing. Every living body produces this noise. It is a feature of biological existence rather than a failing of the instruments. The instruments are sensitive enough to read it because the instruments are designed to read everything, and biological existence includes constant small adjustments, constant minor recalibrations, the endless micro-level conversation between a nervous system and the environment it is trying to navigate. In 19 prior exchange subjects, 9 species, none had produced a truly flat baseline. The flattest prior subject, a Drelathi allied envoy from the Keth Sora delegation, an individual of famously even temperament who had been recommended to us by 2 independent sources, as the most physiologically stable member of his diplomatic corps, had shown a cardiovascular rate variance of ±4 beats per minute across his daily cycle. That was the flattest we had seen. DOS produced almost none of it. Her baseline established itself within 18 hours of arrival, and from that moment forward it was for 37 days almost perfectly static. Cardiovascular rate, 51 beats per the standard Terran minute, not 50 to 53, as the prior Terran liaison officers had shown, not a settled range that averaged to 51. Respiratory cadence, 14 cycles per minute. Tidal volume consistent with her recorded physiology file. Surface temperature, nominal. Galvanic skin conductance, low and flat. Microvascular readings, quiet. Micromuscular tension, low throughout all working sessions, including one on day 5 that required the senior accord liaison mediations because DOS had a substantive disagreement with our technical staff's framing of a joint logistics protocol. She disagreed clearly at length and without visible hesitation. She cited 3 prior accord documents that supported her position, and she was correct about all 3 of them. The mediation went in her favor throughout the entire session, which lasted 4 hours and included 2 periods of what I would describe as genuinely contentious back and forth between DOS and our senior technical office. Her biometric data showed a total stress elevation of approximately 0, standard deviations above her own baseline. On the scale of documented stress responses for any species in comparable situations, 0. 3 standard deviations above a low baseline is essentially indistinguishable from the noise floor. I cataloged it as excellent emotional regulation. I noted that she had won the argument, while appearing entirely unbothered by the fact that she was having it. I moved on. Week 2. Days 8 through 14. She had found her working rhythm on the platform. She knew which corridors required formal diplomatic attire under the Accord's shared use protocols and which were considered informal access spaces, and she navigated between them without apparent effort. She had established a working friendship with analyst Ver Soon, no relation to this assessor, a junior member of our coordination staff who had been assigned to facilitate the joint documentation work. They shared meals in the common facility twice during the week, on days 9 and 12. The monitoring data from those meals showed DOS operating at slightly below her own resting baseline. The cardiovascular and micromuscular patterns consistent with what our physiology files describe as positive social relaxation in Terran individuals. A measurable down-regulation that occurs when a person is in the company of someone they find genuinely pleasant and unthreatening. She was not performing ease during those meals. Or if she was performing it at the physiological level as well as the behavioral one. The week had one notation of interest. On day 12, there was a platform-wide systems briefing. Standard for all personnel and non-Dralathi guests, extended rotations, covering emergency protocols and platform communication procedures. DOS attended along with the 3 other non-Dralathi guests currently aboard. During the portion of the briefing that covered the platform communication systems, specifically the section on the primary array architecture and its relay junction on the 3rd ring, her pupillary response data, captured from a node with a favorable line-of-sight angle, showed a measurable elevation above baseline. Not large, not alarming. A few percentage points of dilation above her resting measure, lasting approximately 4 minutes, which corresponds to the duration of that portion of the briefing. I flagged it in my daily notes as a pupillary response to novel information event, consistent with attentive interest, within the normal range documented for Terran individuals encountering new technical information. I did not connect it to her route choice through the relay junction. I want to record that failure for the panel, specifically and plainly, because the connection was available to me and I did not make it. 2 data points. She chose the route past the relay junction on day 4. She showed measurable pupillary interest in a technical briefing on the relay architecture on day 12. Those 2 data points, taken together, suggest something. I did not take them together. I had no reason to. In isolation, each was within normal parameters. But I want the panel to know that the failure to connect them was mine, not the instrument's. Week 3, days 15 through 21. Protocol at the 3-week mark on any extended exchange recommends a secondary review by a physiology specialist outside the primary assessment team. This is not because the primary assessor is considered unreliable, because a different set of eyes sometimes notices patterns that the primary assessor has been looking at long enough to stop seeing. Brought in physiology specialist Orha Veth from the Directorate's Applied Biology section. She is the best stress physiology specialist this division has access to. Her record with Terran Biometrics specifically runs 15 years, including consultation on both prior human rotations at Keth Vorel. She reviewed the full archive from days 1 through 21. She spent 4 hours with it, reading at the level of individual channel traces rather than summary reports. She then filed a supplementary note, which I am entering into this record verbatim. The note reads, "In full, subject presents stable. Baseline well within normal Terran parameters. Settling curve slightly steep. Subject established baseline faster than historical Terran average. But this is consistent with a well-regulated individual with substantial prior experience in novel environment postings. No anomalous stress indicators. No deception response markers across any of the 14 channels. Recommend continued standard monitoring. No escalation indicated." I want the panel to sit with that note for a moment before continuing. Orha Veth is not wrong in any technical sense. What she observed, she described accurately. What the instruments showed, she read correctly. The instruments were not showing anything they should not have been showing. The settling curve she noted as slightly steep is, in hindsight, the most succinct observation in the document, and I will return to it later. But at the time, 21 days of clean data, and a specialist's secondary review confirming no anomalies, I had no grounds for escalation. I continued standard monitoring. Weeks 4 and 5. Days 22 through 35. The exchange had entered what the Accord documentation calls the deep collaboration phase. Longer working sessions, more technically sensitive subject matter, and the first joint drafting of documents that would enter the shared treaty archive and remain there as part of the Accord's formal record. Maren Doss was engaged during this phase in a way that I noted at the time as exactly what a coordinator of her experience and competence should look like. Prepared, precise in her language choices, occasionally clarifying rather than accepting ambiguity in the shared documentation, and willing to flag disagreements before they became embedded in draft text. She was good at the work. The work was genuinely being done. I want the panel to understand that I am not describing a cover story for something else. The coordination was real, and she was doing it well. Whatever else she was doing at the same time, the Accord's actual business was advancing. Her biometric data across weeks 4 and 5, cardiovascular rate 51, skin conductance, low, micromuscular tension, low throughout the deep sessions, including one in week 4, in which a treaty-sensitive communication protocol was discussed, that I now recognize, in hindsight, she had been specifically briefed to ask about. At the time, I thought her interest in the protocol was professional and routine. Cardiovascular rate during that session, 51. On day 28, she visited the common facility for the midday meal and sat with analyst Vefersoon for slightly over an hour. The conversation, captured by the acoustic monitoring, covered 2 topics. A comparative study of Drelathi and Terran archival practices in treaty documentation, and a discussion of a particular form of Terran music that Soon had expressed curiosity about. Doss described the music at length. A form of structured improvisation, she said, in which the underlying pattern is fixed and the performer makes real-time decisions within that pattern, and the art is in how those decisions interact with the pattern and with the other performers who are making their own decisions at the same time. She said that listeners who understood the form could hear, in a single performance, both the fixed structure and the live choices simultaneously. Soon asked how a listener could tell the difference between a planned sequence and an improvised one. Doss said that was the question, and that the answer was that sometimes you couldn't, from the outside. You had to know the performer. I reviewed that conversation in detail while preparing this report. I cannot determine whether it was a message. I am choosing not to speculate, and I am including it in this record without interpretation. On day 30, She requested and received access to the platform's secondary technical library, a shared-use resource available to all Accord liaison officers, containing publicly released documentation on joint platform specifications and communication standards. She spent 2 hours in the library. The documentation she accessed was consistent with the coordination work she was conducting. Nothing in the access log appeared anomalous. Biometric data throughout the library session. 51:14 low. I am noting the library access now because the documentation she pulled included the publicly released specification overview for the VETH Hall, Standard Communication Relay Architecture, a document that describes, in general terms, the external housing configuration of primary array installations at Accord joint use facilities. I did not flag the library access in my daily log, because accessing publicly available technical documentation is not a monitored behavior on this platform. I am noting it now. Day 31. DOS requested access to the observation deck, the viewport space on the platform's outer ring, typically allocated to non-Drelathi guests as a courtesy space with an exterior view. Standard request. Standard approval. She went to the observation deck at mid-afternoon and spent 11 minutes there, standing at the viewport that faces the platform's outer ring structure. The outer ring structure includes, among other things, the housing for the primary communication array. The array housing is a significant piece of engineering. The panel knows its specifications, and it is visible from the observation deck viewport as a substantial structure on the ring's exterior. She stood at the viewport for 11 minutes, she said, at approximately the 8-minute mark, to no one because she was alone on the deck. That's a beautiful piece of engineering. Then she returned to her quarters. Cardiovascular rate during those 11 minutes, 51. I want the panel to understand what 51 means in context. The observation deck visit came after day 31 of a 42-day exchange. She had been aboard the platform for over 4 weeks. She was looking at the exterior housing of the platform's primary communication array, a piece, infrastructure she had been briefed on, in general terms, during the Day 12 systems briefing, and commenting on it. Cardiovascular rate was 51, the same as her resting baseline, the same as it was during the contentious mediation sessions on Day 5, the same as it was during every working session in weeks 4 and 5, including the one covering the treaty-sensitive communication protocol. I am going to tell the panel something that I did not write in my daily log at the time, because at the time it was not a hypothesis I had formed. I am telling them now because it is the conclusion I reached in the weeks after the exchange ended. She was mapping the array on day 31. She had been mapping it for weeks, from her route choice on day 4, through her pupillary response on day 12, through whatever she was doing during those working sessions. She stood at the viewport on day 31 and looked at the outer housing for 11 minutes, and her cardiovascular rate was 51, because she had decided it would be 51, and she had the trained capacity to hold it there. The time. I logged the visit as routine and noted the comment as a generic appreciation of platform engineering. Cross-referenced it to the week 2 pupillary flag in my internal notes. I did not escalate. I had 42 days of data on this subject, and nothing in it, by any measure this suite could produce, warranted escalation. I want to state, for the record and for the panel, that I do not write the preceding paragraph to excuse the failure. I write it to be precise about what the failure was. The failure was not in the instruments, and it was not a failure of effort or attention. Failure was in the doctrine. The doctrine says biology betrays. I believe the doctrine because for 22 years the doctrine had been correct. It was not correct this time, and I did not consider the possibility that it might not be correct, because I had no prior case in which it had failed. I had no prior case because no prior subject had been capable of doing what Marin Doss was doing. Day 42. I need to describe this day carefully and in full because it is the day that matters, and because the sequence of events within it, not just the 40-second window, the entire day, constitutes the clearest evidence I can offer that what I observed was deliberate and controlled, rather than accidental or physiologically anomalous. The day began by platform schedule as a standard working day. DOS attended a morning coordination session from the 2nd hour to the 5th. A final review of the joint documentation package that represented primary deliverable of the exchange. The session was collaborative and, by all observable measures, collegial. The documentation package was in good shape. There were minor language register disagreements on 3 clauses, all resolved within the session. DOS was engaged and precise, as she had been throughout. Biometric data from the session: cardiovascular rate, 51. Skin conductance, low. Micromuscular tension, low. Unremarkable in every channel. She ate at midday in the common facility with analyst Ver Soon. The conversation that the acoustic monitoring captured was brief and, on the surface, ordinary. A discussion of the documentation session they had just completed. A comment from Soon about a Dralathi filing deadline. A short exchange about the Terran music form they had discussed on day 28. Soon asked whether DOS had managed to record any performances during the exchange. DOS said no, that she hadn't brought anything capable of recording, and then said, with the kind of tone that the acoustic monitoring cataloged as mild irony, that she had been keeping notes instead. She patted the flat carrying case she had with her, which she had taken to carrying to most public spaces on the platform over the preceding 2 weeks. Then, the conversation moved to the documentation deadline, and they finished the meal. I want to note that the flat carrying case, the one she had declared on arrival as containing her journal and attire, was present at 41 of 42 days she was aboard the platform. I did not flag its persistent presence as noteworthy, because it was the kind of case a person carries personal materials in, and she had declared it on arrival, and its initial scan had come back clean. I am noting it now for the panel's reference. The afternoon was, per Accord protocol for extended attachments, an unallocated courtesy gap, free time for the liaison officer, no formal obligations. She used the afternoon to sit in the observation lounge on the 4th, the shared recreational space, and write in her journal. She arrived in the lounge at the 14th hour of the platform's standard daily cycle, settled into a chair at the viewport side of the room. Not the chair closest to the viewport, but the one at a slight angle to it, giving her a partial exterior view while primarily facing the room's interior. And opened the flat case and took out what appeared to be a hand-bound journal with a dark cover and a corresponding pen of the kind used for handwriting. She began writing. I want to describe the observation lounge precisely, because the panel needs to understand what the monitoring coverage looks like in that space. The lounge is the most heavily instrumented non-corridor space on the platform. It is a shared recreational area, which means non-Dralathi guests use it frequently, which means we have prioritized coverage. 41 sensor nodes cover the entire platform. 8 of them are in the observation lounge alone. They are positioned at the 4 corners of the ceiling, 2 along the western wall, and 2 at height on the northern and southern walls. There is no position in that room from which fewer than 5 nodes have direct line of sight. Coverage of the occupant. The chair DOS had selected gave 6 nodes a clear angle on her face and upper body. 4 and additional nodes coverage of her hands in the journal. She wrote for 2 hours and 12 minutes. The monitoring data from those 2 hours and 12 minutes is for 2 hours and 11 minutes and 20 seconds of it, identical to what I had been looking at for 41 days. Cardiovascular rate, 51. Respiratory cadence, 14. Galvanic skin conductance, low. Micromuscular tension, low. Microvascular readings, quiet and stable. Pupillary response, the narrow focused range consistent with reading and writing at close distance. She was, by every measure, writing in her journal. At hour 15:42, second 21 of the station's standard daily cycle. I can tell the panel this to 0.4-second precision because the monitoring suite timestamps every record at that resolution. Every single monitored channel changed. Not gradually. Not in the stepped elevation pattern that characterizes genuine acute stress responses, in which the cardiovascular system typically responds within 2 to 5 seconds, followed by the galvanic system within 8 to 15 seconds, followed by the microvascular system within 15 to 30 seconds, with the micromuscular changes lagging the cardiovascular by a variable interval of 5 to 20 seconds, depending on the nature and intensity of the stressor. That is how a genuine stress response looks in the monitoring data. It has a shape defined by the different response speeds of different physiological systems, which cannot be made to synchronize because they are driven by different mechanisms operating at different timescales. All 14 channels changed simultaneously, within a single sampling interval of 0.4 seconds. Cardiovascular rate, 87 beats per the standard Terran minute. An increase of 36 beats per minute from baseline corresponds to the cardiovascular response of a Terran individual in a state of moderate to severe acute stress or significant physical exertion. Respiratory cadence, 22 cycles per minute at reduced tidal volume, shallow and rapid, consistent with the respiratory pattern of acute stress preparation. Galvanic skin conductance, elevated to a level that our calibration database places in the range of moderate to severe acute emotional arousal or fear response in Terran. Biology, not the highest reading we have calibration data for, but well into the range that a monitoring specialist would flag as significant. Surface temperature at the extremities, reduced by approximately 0.3 degrees Terran standard, consistent with peripheral vasoconstriction under sympathetic nervous system activation. The body routing blood away from the extremities and toward core and major muscle groups in preparation for flight or fight response. Microvascular patterns in the central facial region, elevated, with the specific pattern our calibration database associates with emotional arousal in Terran individuals. Micromuscular tension, elevated across the full facial map, including the periorbital regions, the zygomatic regions, and the mandibular region. All of them simultaneously. Full emotional state activation pattern. Postural shift. She moved forward slightly in the chair. 3 to 4 centimeters. Her prior seated posture. The kind of shift associated with alertness. And the pupillary response, which I could estimate from the microvascular and micromuscular patterns, even without a direct measure. Consistent with significant dilation, she held every single one of those readings, across all 14 channels, for exactly 40 seconds. I have reviewed the data from those 40 seconds more times than I can accurately report to the panel. The simultaneity is not a calibration artifact. I had our platform's lead instrumentation technician perform a full diagnostic review of monitoring suite after the exchange concluded. Before I filed this report, the suite is functioning correctly. Every node was functioning correctly on day 42. The cross-calibration performed at the 4-hour mark prior to the 40-second event firmed all nodes within tolerances. There is no instrumentation explanation for what the data shows. What the data shows is not possible through involuntary means. A genuine acute stress response cannot produce simultaneous multi-channel elevation. The physiology does not permit it. The cardiovascular system, the galvanic system, the microvascular system, and the micromuscular system operate on different timescales and are driven by different neural pathways. They can be made to approximate simultaneous activation over a window of 30 to 90 seconds in cases of extreme, sudden, overwhelming stress, the kind of stressor that triggers an immediate and total survival response. But they cannot be brought to precisely correlated readings within a 0.4-second sampling interval through involuntary means, because the involuntary pathways are not that fast and are not that coordinated. And they cannot, under any involuntary mechanism, be held flat at elevated levels for 40 seconds and then dropped simultaneously back to baseline in a second 0.4-second interval. What the data shows is a voluntary production of a coherent stress signature across all 14 channels, held for 40 seconds, and then withdrawn. Second 41, every channel returned to baseline simultaneously. Cardiovascular rate 51, respiratory 14, skin conductance low, muscular tension low. In a single 0.4-second sampling interval, she was by every measure this platform can produce, the same calm cooperative liaison officer she had been for the preceding 42 days. Then she did two things. The first, she set her pen down on the open journal, and she turned her head slowly and deliberately, and she looked directly at the sensor cluster on the lounge's northern wall. Not at the wall in general, not at the paneling. At the specific cluster, she's mounted flush with the wall paneling at a height of approximately 2 meters. Behind a section of structural composite material that passes visual inspection as decorative cladding, the cluster protrudes 2 millimeters from the wall surface. From Doss's seated position, at the angle she had chosen, it was visible only as a slight irregularity in the paneling that a casual observer would not notice. She was not a casual observer. She looked at the cluster the way a person looks at something they have known the location of for some time. She held that look for 3 seconds. Then she returned her gaze to the journal, picked up her pen, and resumed writing. The second, she said 4 words. Not directed anyone else. She was alone in the lounge, with the exception of 2 Dralathi platform staff who were seated at the far end of the room and not in conversation with her. She said them at a volume consistent with a person speaking to themselves, which is, I am informed by our physiology consultants, a documented Terran cognitive processing behavior. Terran individuals sometimes externalize thoughts as low-volume speech as a means of reinforcing or processing them without intending external communication. The monitoring suite's acoustic capture at the northern wall cluster, which was the closest node with acoustic sensitivity, captured them clearly. She said, I know you're watching. Then she went back to writing in her journal. She remained in the lounge for another 40 minutes, during which her biometric data was, in all 14 channels, indistinguishable from the prior 2 hours and 11 minutes. Then she went to the common facility for the evening meal, ate, spoke briefly with 2 Accord staff she had not previously interacted with, turned to her quarters. Her biometric data through all of it, 51-14, low. I want to note something about those final 14 days that I think the panel will find relevant. In any prior exchange I have run, a subject who had been under covert stress, even a subject who did not know they were being monitored, and therefore had no reason to consciously manage their responses, would show some physiological shift in the days following a high-stress event. The body carries the residue of sustained effort even after the effort ends. Cortisol profiles drift. Sleep state cardiovascular patterns shift slightly. Micromuscular resting tension takes time to fully release. These are involuntary residues. They are not signals in the intelligence sense. They are simply the body returning to its actual baseline after a period of elevated demand. They take time. Maren Doss showed none of it. Her biometric data for the 14 days following the 40-second window was identical to her biometric data for the 37 days preceding it, either producing 42 days of voluntary physiological self-regulation required so little effort that there was no meaningful residue to clear, which would suggest a level of autonomic conditioning I find difficult to model, or she was, in the final 14 days, still choosing what to produce. I cannot determine which of those possibilities is true. I do not know whether the distinction matters. I reviewed the footage from the 40-second window and its immediate context 14 times before I submitted this report. The panel will find the full archive attached. I will not tell them what to conclude from the footage beyond what I have already stated, but I will tell them what I noticed on the 8th review that I had not noticed on the first 7. In the 3 seconds during which she was looking at the sensor cluster on the northern wall, biometric data, which had already returned to baseline, did not move. It was 51-14 and low. She was looking directly at the primary monitoring node in that room, knowing it was there, knowing she had just produced a controlled physiological event for its benefit, and her cardiovascular rate was 51. I would like the panel to consider what that requires. She completed the exchange. The remaining 14 days after day 42 followed the same pattern as the preceding 41. Working sessions, shared meals with analyst Ver Soon, occasional use of the observation deck and lounge. The joint documentation package was finalized and transferred to the Accord's shared archive on day 54. On day 54, in the final working session, she reviewed the complete package with our senior documentation officer and signed the Accord's standard certification form attesting to the accuracy of her contributions. She signed it with the same pen she used to write in her journal. Biometric data during the signing, 51-14, low. She attended her departure briefing on day 55, expressed formal thanks to the coordination staff, she said, to the platform's senior liaison officer, that Keth Vorel was an exceptionally well-run facility, and that she had found the exchange valuable. Collected her 3 pieces of personal luggage and her flat carrying case and left on schedule. Her biometric data for the final 14 days, 51. 14. Low. Not a single channel varied outside her established baseline from the moment after the 40-second window to the moment she stepped off the platform. She had given us exactly what she chose to give us for 42 days. She then chose to give us one true thing for 40 seconds and told us what she had been doing. And then she went back to giving us what she chose to give us for another 14 days, packed her luggage, thanked the staff, and left. I owe the panel a physiological explanation before I close, because this report will not be credible without one. In the weeks following the exchange, I consulted 3 independent specialists on stress physiology and voluntary biological control. All 3 were brought in under full counterintelligence cover and given only the information necessary for their consultation. None of them were told who the subject was or what the exchange was for. The first specialist was Dr. Hevron Voth, a CORD-certified, 15 years of clinical experience with Terran biology at 2 joint medical facilities. I showed her the data from the 40-second window without context and asked her to describe what she was looking at. She was quiet for a long time after reviewing it. Then she said, "This isn't a spontaneous response. The simultaneity is wrong for any known involuntary mechanism. You can get voluntary influence over individual channels in trained individuals. Cardiovascular rate in endurance athletes operating at high autonomic conditioning. Skin conductance in practitioners of specific Terran meditative disciplines. But coordinated multi-channel control producing a coherent, readable stress signature isn't something I've seen documented at this level." She paused again. Then she said, "The whole duration is the other thing. Seconds, flat-topped. That's not physiology, that's control." She reviewed the data a second time and added quietly, "The drop is as interesting as the spike. To take all 14 channels to baseline simultaneously, within a single sampling interval, that's the same problem in reverse. That's not what the nervous system does on its own." I asked her whether she had seen anything in the prior Terran clinical literature that might explain it. Not the specific data, the general capability it implied. She thought for a moment. She said that there were historical Terran clinical records describing individuals with unusual autonomic conditioning, not medical anomalies, but trained individuals from specific professional contexts who showed documented voluntary influence over physiological channels that were considered involuntary in standard biology. She said the records were incomplete and inconsistently collected, partly because the individuals in question had, historically, not been eager to be studied under controlled conditions. She said that the general consensus in Terran clinical literature was that voluntary, autonomic control existed in a documented but narrow range, and that the ceiling of that range was almost certainly not fully characterized. She said, "Challenge with studying a capability that is most useful when undetected is that the best practitioners don't participate in studies." She said that last part in the same tone she had used for everything else, clinical, precise, without apparent editorializing. I noted it anyway. The second specialist, Dr. Aurel Vaneth, research background in Terran stress physiology, prior consultation work with the Voreth Sustained Response Institute, reviewed the full 6-week archive rather than just the 40-second window. He spent 9 hours with it. His written analysis runs to 12 pages. I am extracting the most relevant section for this report. He wrote, "The 6-week baseline warrants attention independent of the terminal event. Human physiological baselines at genuine rest are not this consistent over this duration. Cardiovascular rate in a healthy adult Terran at rest fluctuates across a daily range of 6 to 12 beats per minute, driven by circadian rhythm, thermal regulation, postural adjustments, and the low-level cognitive processing that does not cease during waking activity. Skin conductance shows comparable drift. The subject's data from hour 18 of day 1 through the 40-second event on day 42 does not show this drift. The baseline is, by normal biological standards, too clean. It looks less like a person at genuine rest than like a person actively producing a resting state output. Producing a stable baseline actively requires more effort than simply inhabiting one. It requires monitoring and adjusting. The fact that it was maintained for 37 days without measurable drift suggests either that the monitoring and adjusting became, over time, largely automatic, which is consistent with the kind of long-term autonomic conditioning that some elite Terran training regimens aim to develop, or that the stability I am observing is a capability I have simply not seen before at this level and duration. He then added the paragraph I consider most significant for the panel's purposes. I would like to be clear that I am not suggesting pharmacological assistance. The metabolic analysis on file, voluntarily provided by the subject per accord protocol, is clean. No cardiovascular agents, no galvanic modulators, no sedative compounds. What the data implies is voluntary trained self-regulation across multiple channels simultaneously, at a precision and duration that exceeds DEETs. What I confidently say is documented in the clinical literature on human physiological control. I am not saying it is impossible. The documented range of voluntary physiological influence in trained human individuals is wider than non-human. Researchers typically assume, and the upper bounds of that range are, by the evidence of this data, further out than my prior work would have suggested. The third specialist was not a clinician. She was researcher Principal Sorvith Ahn, senior researcher at the Dralathi Applied Cognition Sciences Institute, working on the intersection of voluntary behavioral control and physiological output in multi-species contexts. She is one of the researchers who has been working on Terran physiology since the Accord signing, and whose work the panel will have encountered in the Institute's published assessments. I described the question to her hypothetically, without specifics. A subject, under sustained multi-channel passive monitoring, produces a 40-second controlled physiological event, and then returns to a stable baseline, with no evidence of any pharmacological assistance. I asked her what she thought. She stopped me before I had finished describing it and said, "You're asking about the upper boundary of voluntary multi-channel physiological control in a trained Terran?" I said yes. She said, "Documented upper boundary of voluntary cardiovascular control in an elite conditioned Terran individual in short duration experimental settings is roughly plus or minus 18% from baseline. Galvanic control in trained practitioners. Certain long-duration meditative traditions have studied this systematically, runs up to 45% suppression, again in short-duration settings with motivated subjects who know they are being measured. Those are experimental condition upper bounds. The interesting variable in what you are describing is sustained duration in an unmeasured subject, or rather, a subject who is being measured but has decided what the measurement will read." She paused. That changes the calculations significantly. Motivation and practice interact in human physiology in ways that are not well understood from the outside, in part because the most motivated practitioners of voluntary physiological control do not typically participate in controlled research settings. I asked her what she meant by the most motivated practitioners. She said, "The Terrans have a documented history, centuries of it, prior to the Accord, of professional training regimens specifically designed to produce voluntary physiological control under adversarial monitoring conditions. The historical context is intelligence and counterintelligence operations. The goal in that context is exactly what you are describing, a trained individual who can be monitored by instruments designed to read stress and intent, and can produce the readings they choose to produce, rather than the readings their actual state would produce." She looked at the data I had given her. 42 days is longer than any controlled study I am aware of, but it is consistent with a motivation structure that controlled studies cannot replicate. I asked her which professional communities, in the Terran context, had developed these training regimens. I asked her whether she had encountered anything in the research record that would help estimate how many Terran individuals might possess this capability, or how we would identify them from a personnel file. She said the research record was not useful for that question, for the reason she had already given. The most capable practitioners had not been studied. She said that the personnel records for professionals in the relevant historical Terran contexts typically described individuals in terms that were accurate but not diagnostic. Competent, experienced, reliable, methodical. She said, if a personnel file describes someone as having this capability, they wouldn't have it in a useful way. The utility depends on the capability not being visible. She looked at me steadily and added, the thing you are asking, how do we identify them in advance, is precisely the problem the capability is designed to prevent you from solving. I had no useful follow-up to that. I thanked her for her time and ended the consultation. I want the panel to note what researcher Principal On was describing. A professional training tradition, developed over centuries, specifically optimized to defeat exactly the kind of monitoring this platform runs. She was not speculating. She was describing documented Terran history. The question of how many individuals trained in that tradition are currently operating in accord, liaison roles is one I cannot answer, and I am not confident the Accord's personnel documentation would allow me to answer it even with full access. She said, the ones that do what you do. I am going to leave that statement in the record without commentary, and let the panel draw their own conclusions about its implications for how we understand the population from which the Accord selects its liaison officers. I have three recommendations. I will state them briefly, because this document is already substantially longer than a standard assessment report, and because the panel does not need my analysis beyond the facts and the conclusions those facts support. The first recommendation, the monitoring suite aboard Keth Voral should be reviewed not for technical malfunction. It is not malfunctioning, but for the nature of what passive biometric monitoring can and cannot tell us about a subject who is choosing what to produce. The suite measures what the body gives it. 400 years that has been sufficient. Because the doctrine held that the body cannot choose. The doctrine may need revision as it applies specifically to Terran biological subjects, and the revision is not trivial. If the body can choose what to give the instruments, then the instruments are measuring what the subject decides to show, not what the subject actually is. The difference between those two things is the entire premise of this division's monitoring program. The second recommendation. The Accord's joint personnel vetting and credentialing procedures should be examined for whether the distinction between civilian, diplomatic professionals and intelligence-trained personnel is verifiable, using the documentation currently available to us. I am not making a finding that Maren Das was improperly credentialed, or that she misrepresented her background to the Accord. Personnel file describes a 15-year career in diplomatic and coordination work, and the work she did during the exchange was genuine. I am noting that the capability she demonstrated is, by the account of 3 independent specialists, associated with specific professional training contexts. The panel can determine what weight to give that association. The third recommendation, Trunt, the archived biometric data from the 2 prior human liaison officers who served short rotations at Keth Voral, should be reviewed with the question, baseline consistency specifically in mind. Not because I have any current concern about either of those individuals, but because Dr. Vainath's analysis raises the possibility that the cleanliness of Das's baseline is not unique to her, and because knowing whether prior data shows similar patterns would help us understand whether what I am reporting is an individual capability or something this division should build into its standard assessment model for Terran subjects as a general variable. I will close with an observation that I am not offering as a formal recommendation, because it is not amenable to a formal recommendation. It is, instead, the thing I keep returning to when I review the footage of Day 42 and consider how to characterize what I witnessed. In 14 years of operation, the monitoring suite aboard Keth Voral has never had a subject who knew we were watching. Every other subject, across 9 species and 12 exchanges, continued behaving as they would have behaved if they had known, because they did not know, and their biology ensured that their actual states were visible through the instruments regardless. The asymmetry, we know we are watching, they do not, is the foundation on which the entire program operates. Without it, passive monitoring does not produce actionable data. It produces what the subject wants it to produce. Maren Das collapsed that asymmetry from her side. She arrived on this platform, identified our monitoring infrastructure, over the course of the first few weeks, maintained voluntary multi-channel physiological control for 37 days without a measurable slip, and then on day 42, used a single 40-second window of true signal. Not a mistake, not a crack in the control, but a deliberate broadcast. Looked at our sensor cluster and told us she had known all along. Then she held the control for another 14 days, pleaded her assignment, thanked our staff, and left. She was not hostile. The work was real. I do not know, and this report does not claim to know. What else she may have accomplished during the exchange beyond the documented coordination work. What I know is what the instruments recorded, and what they recorded was what she chose to show them. I have been in counterintelligence for 22 years. I have assessed hundreds of subjects across a dozen species. I have never filed an assessment report in which the conclusion was that the subject had been running the monitoring from the inside. I am filing one now. The instruments are functional. The data is attached in full. I recommend the panel review it at the channel level, beginning with the Day 12 pupillary annotation and the Day 31 observation deck note in my daily log, and read them the way I should have read them in real time, then decide what to do next. Filed under Counterintelligence Archive Code Keth Vorals, X7 Soon v. Deo 42. Distribution: 3 copies, no secondary transmission. Assessor Principal Veleth Soon Drilathi Strategic Assessment Directorate, Counterintelligence Division Assessment Platform. Keth Voral,